please be seated.
Morning, everybody.
The next witness is Marta Proctor.
Sir, turn your mic on.
There it is.
I heard what you had to say. Thank you for the explanation. Madam Reporter, did you want it repeated?
Yes, please.
Mr. Trudeau, would you mind?
Mr. Neubauer is in court in Toronto this morning and apologizes for not being here. I expect him this afternoon. Thank you.
Bible.
Take the Bible.
Marta Proctor,
Please confirm this one.
Marta Proctor.
Do you swear to tell?
Good morning, Ms. Proctor.
Good morning.
I'm going to start with some questions about your background and education. I understand that you have a Bachelor of Arts from York University,
That's correct.
and you have a diploma in public administration from the University of Western Ontario.
That's correct.
In terms of your work experience, you've worked in public service with a focus on recreation services since 1987.
I believe that's correct.
Would you please provide the inquiry with a brief overview of your experience in recreation administration?
Okay. I'll start with the fact that I have over 30 years of public service. My first years in municipal government were primarily in the programming end, in the delivery of programs and services. But I've been very fortunate and privileged to been provided with numerous opportunities to grow in responsibility, and through that I've gained experience in managing a variety of programs, facilities, and recreation spaces. Would you like me to go through some of my positions?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I started as a recreation programmer. After spending numerous years doing programming, I moved into an area supervisor in what amalgamated into the city of Toronto. I started in a former smaller municipality called York. As an area supervisor, I was responsible for a large geographic area that included 2 indoor pools, 2 outdoor pools, 2 arenas, a variety of community space in schools and private spaces as well that we administered programs. From there, I moved into a project manager role with the City of Toronto that wasn't specifically in recreation, but looked at strategic initiatives and integrated service planning with primary emphasis on youth in marginalized communities. So I worked a lot with internal departments on collaborative programming along with community service providers and community stakeholders. After leaving the City of Toronto, I accepted a position with the Halton Conservation Authority. I started as manager of one of their largest parks, Castle Glen Eden. It was a significant change from my municipal urban experience to move to a more rural area, and gave me the opportunity to manage a series of programs and facilities that was very different than what I did in the City of Toronto. So Castle Glen Eden had an open waterfront in the summer with boats and swimming areas, as well as a large events venue where we had huge triathlons, downhill races, all sorts of activities. And in the winter, we managed one of the largest urban ski centers in southern Ontario. I was there for actually, I was the manager for 6 months, and then I was promoted to the director of all the parks, and once again had the opportunity to broaden my operational experience to include unique venues like Crawford Lake, which had an Iroquoian village, Mountsburg, which had a whole birds of prey component. There was rock climbing, camping, and all sorts of other interesting venues. After spending just under 4 years with the Conservation Authority, I was successful in a competition for the position here in Collingwood as what became the Director of Parks, Recreation and Culture. And I spent 4 years here and once again had a diverse portfolio that included recreation facilities, programming, as well as cultural and events components. From here, I moved to Gravenhurst, where, again, I assumed a similar position, but also it was the director initially of Recreation, Arts and Culture, where I was responsible for the recreation programming and operations, not capital planning and facilities in that location. And I was also asked to take on the portfolio of corporate communications and marketing while I was there. I retired from Gravenhurst, and my husband and I and our children had always been interested in living in a resort community in British Columbia, and I was successful in a competition for a position in Fernie, BC, where I'm the Director of Community Services. So once again, I have the recreation portfolio there, but it's a newly defined department with a primary focus on developing a sustainable asset management program. So I'm responsible, once again, for coordinating internal departments and external stakeholders in the community on planning for the future of our facilities and programs and services. I'm also responsible for the corporate communication portfolio there.
Thank you. I understand that you were the Director of Parks, Recreation and Culture for the town of Collingwood during the period between August 2010 and May 2014.
That's correct.
And during that time, you took a personal leave for several months that started in October 2012.
That's correct.
Before you began working in Collingwood, what experience did you have in capital planning and facilities, in particular with respect to planning and overseeing the construction of new facilities?
So my role in planning and overseeing was primarily at the management level. I don't have technical expertise in engineering or planning or architecture, but in my roles, first of all, in the programming end of things early in my career, we were often engaged in capital projects to give design or citizen engagement components into the process. When I assumed the role of supervisor and manager, I clearly had more responsibility, although I've always worked with either external expertise or internal expertise to develop those projects. And in many cases, if not most, it would be a combination of both. There would be internal expertise, and we'd hire the services of external experts to do the either concept design or the detailed design and costing of a project.
Had you been involved in the construction of a new recreation facility before you moved to the town of Collingwood?
I had been involved in input on projects, and my time at the Conservation Authority, we built quite a bit of infrastructure when I was there. We had plans for a new Iroquoian village. We had built, done some renovations to a facility in Mountsburg, and we also executed 3 master plans for the park redevelopments. But those wouldn't be specific to a recreation facility. A multi-purpose recreation facility. They were smaller components.
When you joined staff here at the town of Collingwood, were you provided with any training on the purchasing bylaw?
I wouldn't say that I was provided specific training. However, I was oriented to our policy and procedures manual, and that is something that by nature I would look into just because it's the way I administer the delivery of services.
Did you recall, did you have an understanding of which member of staff you would go to if you had questions about the purchasing bylaw?
Yes, I do.
Who would that be?
That would have been the treasurer.
I'm going to have your job description shown to you on the screen. It's at TOC 600-350. And if we could scroll down a little bit more to see the duties and responsibilities. First of all, are you familiar with this document?
I do recall this document.
And was it available to you when you took on the role as Director of Parks, Recreation and Culture?
Yes, it was.
I want to turn specifically to the first item under duties and responsibilities, which says assess parks, facilities, and program needs, authorize and or make recommendations to council on same and facilitate their construction/implementation. What did you understand that meant for you in terms of what you were responsible for when you came to work for the town?
That meant to me that it was my responsibility to look at the delivery of services, the facilities on which we provide those services, or invite other community stakeholders to provide services on municipal property, to make sure that they're in proper working condition, and where there is an identified need or opportunity to invest in new facilities, it would be my responsibility to lead that process.
I'm going to turn from this now to some of the work that you did on the town's recreation facilities. And just for context, I'm going to show you some paragraphs from the foundation document. Could we start with paragraph 60 of the foundation document? And this is just to help orient us in space and time. Paragraph 60 describes that council established a volunteer steering committee, which we refer to as the Central Park Steering Committee, on May 2nd, 2011, to do work on proposed multi-use recreation facility at Central Park. If we could turn to paragraph 63 of this document, we can see that the Central Park Steering Committee published its final report dated March 5th, 2012. That report, amongst other things, contained a series of recommendations. If we could turn to paragraph 69 of this document. The Central Park Steering Committee's final report was incorporated into a staff report that was presented to council. If we could scroll down a little bit further, at the March 5th, 2012 council meeting. We could turn to, just scroll down a little bit more so we can see paragraph 70. The recommendations that staff provided to council at that meeting were that council endorsed the recommended scenario for the redevelopment of Central Park, that council approved the development of a funding strategy with recommendations to be presented within 6 months, and that council authorized town staff to develop actions and timelines for all other recommendations as outlined in the steering committee final report to be presented within 6 months. And what we can see is that council unanimously voted to endorse the Central Park Steering Committee report in principle, and it authorized staff to develop actions and timelines for the other recommendations to be presented within 6 months. Ultimately, the council also approves the formation of a Phase 2 steering committee to look at funding strategies. Is that consistent with what you remember about how the work of the Central Park Steering Committee was brought to a close?
That is correct.
Can you provide us with a very high-level overview of the approach that the Central Park Steering Committee took to answering the question or the mandate that council provided it.
Could you please repeat the question?
Yes, I'd just like to understand at a high level what process the Central Park Steering Committee followed to address the mandate that it was given by council.
I have to start by saying that it was the first time that I've worked with a volunteer committee on such an initiative, but I felt very fortunate to have some dedicated and experienced people on that committee. So I felt that the process we undertook, and there were recommendations to council to solicit the services of experts at certain points, and was a very comprehensive and not extensive but adequate process to bring forward the recommendations, and did involve consultation and input from the citizens, and those recommendations were reflected in the final findings.
You mentioned consultation and input from the citizens. Why was that an important component of the work that the committee did?
It is my belief that the role of administration is to research and bring back information based on policy or strategic directions that council gives to staff. As part of our due diligence, there is experts' opinions or information, evidence-based information to support that, but also it is the reflection of the citizens and how their tax dollars are spent that should also inform that process. So that's why I emphasize that point, because it's both the technical expertise and the citizen input on what the proposed investment or service level is that is important for council to understand in making final decisions.
I'm going to show you an email at TOC 131863. Scroll down. Perfect. Actually, you can scroll down to the bottom. So this is an email chain dated March 27th, 2012, after the Central Park Steering Committee has issued its final report. It's an email from Brian Saunderson, who is a member, or sorry, what we're looking at first is an email from Brian Saunderson, who is a co-chair of the Central Park Steering Committee, to Pat Mills. And actually, could you scroll down even further to the bottom of the chain? Thanks. You can see this starts with an email from Patrick Mills to Brian Saunderson. He is looking to set up a meeting. And he goes on to say, in order to make the best possible use of time, I would love you to outline needs moving forward. Am I correct that you're looking at a double arena? Any details that will be helpful? Swimming pools, details covered. And then he goes on to say, I would be able to use your information and give you preliminary outlines of possibility re our ability to meet your needs. If you could scroll down a little bit more just so we can see the signature line. He goes on to say, I understand that we are at the very early stages, but the project seems to fit Sprung's ability to deliver based on 12,000 buildings built in 95 countries. He goes on to provide some more information about Sprung and says the more detail, the better. And if you could scroll up. You can see that Mr. Saunderson responds to Mr. Mills and says that he'll get back shortly on the date and location. He directs Mr. Mills to a blog where there's reports and information about the work of the steering committee. You can scroll down a little bit further. And then he indicates also that the steering committee's final report is available on the blog. And if we could scroll up. We can see that Mr. Saunderson then forwards this email exchange to yourself and Claire Tucker, who is the other steering committee co-chair. He explains that he was contacted by Mr. Mills, who is works for Sprung, He indicates that Mr. Mills has heard about the Central Park Steering Committee, saw Mr. Saunderson's name, and thought he would give Mr. Saunderson a call to catch up, and explains that he's anxious to meet and discuss the project. Mr. Saunderson expresses some concern and asks for some advice about how to respond, saying that he's wondering if he's in a conflict and he doesn't want to be connected to any particular group, builder, etc. And if we could scroll up to the top, you provide a response where you say, I believe you can tell him quite honestly that the Central Park project is not at the design phase, and once we are at that phase, there will be a posted process by which appropriate design features would be considered. What is the posted process that you're referring to in this email?
The posted process that I would be referring to would be some sort of RFP or RFQ process or a tender process, which is what I would have assumed would be the next phase of the work when we got there.
And why did you send this suggestion to Mr. Saunderson? Why did you think this was the appropriate response?
Because that is based on all the training and experience I've had that would be the process to follow.
What did you learn from the training and experience you had about the process? Like, why is this the appropriate way to address this request?
Because local government should follow a transparent process that is open to multiple submissions and based on an assessment of the qualifications and experience and price. We should be picking the best or recommending to council the best company to fill the contract.
Maybe put it a different way. What issues would you see arising if Mr. Saunderson engaged in a conversation with Mr. Mills, who was a representative of a supplier of a particular product?
A conflict of interest.
Explain to me what conflict you would be concerned about there.
That we would be prejudicing or putting a company in an advantageous position on a bid with information that wasn't open to other submitters.
Do you recall receiving any further information from Mr. Saunderson about interactions with anyone from the Sprung company?
I can't recall anything specific, but I recall numerous conversations with many people that mentioned the name Sprung, but nothing specific with Mr. Saunderson.
This email is dated March 27th, 2012. Do you recall the next time that you did hear the name Sprung in connection with the town and potential recreation facility development?
I believe it was several months later. I can't recall specifically when.
Leaving the timing aside, can you tell us what you remember about the next time the name Sprung came up in connection with the town's recreation facilities?
What I recall is a reference by the deputy mayor when we were at an opening ceremony for the fire hall, indicating that in the near future the outdoor pool will be covered by a structure. I can't recall if he used the word sprung in that conversation.
Can you help us understand why that conversation came to mind in response to the question, when did you next hear about Sprung in connection with the town?
The conversation comes to mind because that was when I became very unclear on which direction we were heading with our project. In my mind, there were recommendations from the Central Park Steering Committee that have never been resolved, and I felt we still needed to finish that process. And in the meantime, some other option is being introduced to me without any process by which that direction, policy direction, strategic direction was given from council as a whole. And from there, multiple conversations in multiple forums occurred, and I can't place them chronologically or succinctly, but it became a very difficult and confusing process.
We could look at paragraph 58 of the foundation document. Sorry, paragraph 89. Some more background information just to give us context for the questions that I have for you. Paragraph 89 states that CAO Kim Wingrove was given notice of termination on April 3rd, 2012. And then if we could jump ahead to paragraph 95 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes that council appointed Mr. Ed Houghton as acting CAO on April 12th, 2012. And following that, an executive management committee was formed. What did you understand the role of the executive management committee was?
From what I recall, there was no detailed description shared with staff about the executive management committee role. However, Mr. Houghton did have a one-on-one conversation with me to explain his intention with forming this committee was to help him guide the organization and make good decisions, and that he selected this group based on specific expertise that he felt was valuable to him, and he hoped I wasn't offended that I wasn't part of it.
What did you understand the executive management committee's role was in making decisions?
Initially, I had no context for their role, but over time, there would be remarks made that we make decisions as a team or things. They were just off-the-cuff comments, which led me to frame my own opinion. And that was that this was a group that was looking at key corporate decisions together, and sometimes other people would be invited, at times I was invited, and I certainly called upon the expertise of those people because they often had more intel than I did when I was trying to respond or prepare information for council's consideration, and I lacked clarity.
When you say that they had more intel than you did, what are you referring to? What information did they have that you did not have?
In my opinion, and it was reinforced in reading the background documents that I was provided in preparation for today, there were numerous conversations informally, whether in writing or one-on-one, that occurred on topics behind the scenes and funneled through the executive management committee and didn't necessarily come as direction from council as a whole to the appropriate staff.
When you refer to the background document, are you referring to the foundation document that we're looking at on the screen right now?
There were numerous documents sent to me, and I believe yes. This is one of them for sure.
And then you say that you had described that there was background information that came to you through the executive management committee. Did you have that experience generally in the work that you were doing on the town's recreation facilities?
Absolutely.
Your job description required you to report to the CAO of the town. Did the appointment of the acting CAO and/or the formation of the executive management committee change the reporting nature of your job at all, or who you reported to?
It is my opinion that in principle, it did not change that. However, in how we functioned things changed significantly.
Can you describe the significant changes that you just referred to there?
Prior to this change, if I had any questions, I would have gone directly to the CEO to clarify the intent of council or things that I heard occurring that did not make sense to me, and to seek direction or input or strategy or ideas about how we should approach it in an appropriate way. When this change occurred, first of all, Mr. Houghton had other responsibilities, so his physical presence was not always here. But there was the implication that there was shared responsibility amongst the group, and I worked very closely with my colleagues here, and therefore I would often call upon the clerk or the treasurer, depending on the topic, to seek their input and direction, or not direction, input, and try to set direction for the initiative together so that it had the greatest chance of fulfilling what I believed our responsibility was.
Did you find that you were consulting the clerk or the treasurer more frequently than you would have if they weren't on the executive management committee?
Absolutely.
Did you find that the existence of the acting CAO and the executive management committee, your perception of the shared responsibility and the things that you've just described, affected the way that you were able to do your job?
Absolutely.
How did it affect your ability to do your job?
Primarily, it created another layer, and I felt like I was often translating things I was hearing non-directly. They would be through comments or suggestions that we've got to do this or we're looking at this. I'm like, where'd that come from? So I was always trying to clarify the ideas that were propping up out of what felt like thin air. And in reading the documents now, I see they were behind the scenes discussions that were giving people direction to look into or explore certain things, and I wasn't aware of those, and therefore I was trying to meet with people to understand what was going on so that I could assume my role and provide responsible, accurate information back to all of council so they would understand the scope of some of the ideas or decisions being explored.
Okay, a couple of questions about that. Focusing specifically on the work that you were doing on potential new recreation facilities for the town. When you refer to suggestions that are coming to you that you're trying to interpret and translate, where are those suggestions coming from?
From what I can recall, the majority of them were coming from my colleagues, and primarily the Executive Management Committee.
Okay, so you're getting suggestions and information from the Executive Management Committee, and what steps are you taking to try to clarify the information you're getting?
From what I can recall, and it's not specifics, it's more the general intent, was that the Central Park Steering Committee work is dead and gone, and we're heading in another direction, and stay tuned, there's more coming, and there could be other options we will be looking at. And that some members of council weren't happy with the work of the committee, and we will be looking at other options. So that's when I would ask, well, what are the options? Let's get them on the table so that we can do the proper work to explore them.
Before you move on, you described a process that evolved as a difficult one. In relation to that facility, the facilities we're talking about, how was it difficult?
With all due respect, I don't remember where I used the word difficult, but when I reflect on this time, I would describe it as difficult. So first of all, beginning with the work of the volunteer steering committee, that isn't a traditional process that I've seen used often. There is the work of volunteers along the way, but there usually would be technical experts leading that process. However, that was the will of all of council and the direction, so we took that process, and it took time to put out an expression of interest for volunteers to select them and to establish terms of reference. And as I said, we were working in partnership with the YMCA, and some of the volunteers that we had on our committee had a lot of expertise in this area. So we set a course that I felt was very appropriate for the work we were called to do. So I didn't find the process difficult working with the steering committee. It was after the steering committee made their recommendations and we were trying to move to the next phases of the work that it became very difficult. The CAO was let go. There was no clarity or consistency in who I could speak to on direction, and there seemed to be multiple messages coming about what we're doing next and how we're to do it without a defined course of action. And I was trying to understand where these messages were coming from and how we bring them in front of council to set clear direction and policy for staff to follow.
Following along on what you've just described to His Honor, if we could look at the email chain at TOC 155056. And if we could scroll down to the bottom of this email chain so we can see the first email. This is an email dated May 8th, 2012 from Councillor Kevin Lloyd to the town councillors and name blacked out, but Proctor, in his email, Councillor Kevin Lloyd describes that we approved a new committee to investigate a funding formula for the complex, and I think that's a reference to the multi-use complex. He asks, why would we proceed with spending $44,000 on hiring a consultant before the committee responsible has had time to review its value and worth? And says that PPPs, which I believe is public-private partnerships, are part of the funding strategy. He goes on to say that if we are forming a fundraising committee of skilled professionals, we should waive judgment until they report back to us. We could scroll down a little bit further. He goes on to say, also, I believe there should be a backup scenario developed that constructs the complex in stages, amortizing construction and costs over a number of years, perhaps 10. He suggests perhaps starting with an upgraded pool and 2 ice pads. He talks about changes that could be made to the Eddie Bush Memorial Arena. He goes on to say that he doesn't want to rain on anyone's parade, but council has to be pragmatic. He doesn't believe the project will fly at a price tag of $35 million today. We can get what the public wants now and complete the vision over time. And if you could scroll up, see that you provide a response to those that Mr. Lloyd emailed. You thank Councillor Lloyd for his comments. And you go on to say, I would like to respectfully mention that the recommendations you propose below would be outside the current council-approved mandate and would require a new feasibility study. You say we could certainly consider this option should that be the decision and direction of council versus responding to the recommendations and directions presented in Central Park Steering Committee's final report. So first of all, is this an example of the kind of message you were talking about that indicated a different direction than what had been recommended to council?
Yes, it is.
When you say that you would like to respectfully mention that the recommendations proposed below would be outside the current council-approved mandate, What are you talking about there?
To be honest, I'd need to read his Councillor Lloyd's email to answer that. And this is just one example of multiple emails that came that aren't sitting very precisely in my memory bank, and it was quite some time ago.
Okay. Could you scroll down to show Ms. Proctor, Councillor Lloyd's email? Please scroll down to show the remainder of the email. Okay, and just for added background and context, at this point in time, May 8th, Council has voted to approve or endorse the Central Park Steering Committee report in principle, authorize staff to develop actions and timelines for the recommendations in the report, approve the formation of a Phase 2 steering committee to look at funding options, and deferred the retainer of a consultant to help with a market sounding for P3 opportunities. So that is where things stand at the time that this email is sent. So if we could scroll back up to the top, my question for you was, when you said that the recommendations that Councillor Lloyd proposed would be outside the current council-approved mandate, what were you talking about there?
When the committee did their work, we hired the services of an architect, an expert, to do the costing and concept design work. That concept design work did not include, which I'm referring to as the feasibility study, did not include all the components nor phasing as had been proposed in Councillor Lloyd's email, and that is what I believe I'm referencing.
Okay, so when you say the proposal would require a new feasibility study, what were you envisioning?
Revisiting the existing concept and adjusting it and re-establishing it based on the recommendations that he was proposing, which at this point I can't remember what was included and what wasn't in terms of ball diamonds, how many ice pads were in that concept. So that's why I'm assuming it revisits the whole layout and the components that would be included. I'm also pretty sure that the concept design that the steering committee came up with did not include covering the outdoor rink. So, but I can't say 100%. So that's what I believe I'm referring to.
Okay, so at a high level, you're referring to retaining a consulting architect to look at the feasibility of the suggestions that Councillor Lloyd has made?
That would be required if we were to pursue his recommendation.
I'm going to turn from this email to a strategic planning workshop that Council holds on June 11th, 2012. If we could go to paragraph 140 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes a slide presentation that you circulate in advance of a strategic planning workshop that Council held on June 11th, 2012. It's a slide presentation that's going to be given at that session. I'm actually going to ask that you be shown a copy of the slideshow itself. So if we could pull up the documents at TOC 170303. You're looking at the first page. I'm going to be asked that you be shown the second slide. Second slide outlines the goals of the session to develop a cohesive go-forward plan on the development of a recreation facility at Central Park, address the ancillary issues of Eddie Bush, relocation of the baseball diamond, and the future public communication. And if you go down to the next slide, slide 3, this slide identifies the necessary council decisions to move forward, and they are: is there still support for this project as presented by the steering committee? Commit funds to move forward with necessary steps on this project, and the slide identifies architecture, engineering, legal, et cetera. Confirm locations for displaced infrastructure / ball diamonds. You scroll down a little bit further. Is the town moving forward with market sounding, and is a steering committee needed to assist with next steps, define roles and responsibilities? So show you that information by way of background. Do you recall attending this steering committee session?
Yes, I do.
What did you understand the purpose of that session was?
From what I can recall, this was my effort, working with my colleagues, to establish some clarity on a direction that I felt I was given by council to pursue the development of a multi-use facility at Central Park in partnership with the YMCA, to now a bunch of information flowing out there that wasn't aligning, and I needed to clarify what our work was to be going forward. I do recall, and this only reinforces this further, that there were other decisions that need to be taken into consideration with whichever direction we went. If we were to redevelop Central Park, there were potential implications to ball diamonds, and where we could use what would occur with those, or where they would need to be moved if in fact that was required. There was still the question about Eddie Bush Arena and what we were going to do. And this wasn't the only project I was working on at this time. There was the whole discussion about the grain terminals and the waterfront area there, what's going to happen. So simultaneous to this, there was a whole lot of discussion about P3 grants and whether we should be applying for P3 grants for the recreation facility. And I was involved, along with one of my colleagues, in researching those opportunities. And we determined that although P3s are very appropriate in certain type of construction that is municipal, it might not be the best suited for the recreation facilities. However, it could have worked with perhaps another project that could have offset the cost of a multipurpose center. So these were all the things we were trying to clarify and explain to council at a time that was very busy with numerous decisions on the table or being put on the table.
Could you explain to us at a high level what a P3 grant is, what it involves?
Well, I'll first explain what a P3 partnership is. So it's a public-private partnership, and again, I'm not an expert on P3s, but at a high level, it is a public-private partnership where there is responsibility on the private sector through a process to be selected to construct and possibly manage a project for a designated period of time to regain some of the costs of that construction and minimize somehow the impact on the municipality. The federal government and provincial government at that time was big on supporting public-private partnerships in appropriate scenarios, and therefore was giving grants to municipalities who chose to pursue this type of construction type. And that's why there was a lot of interest in that. However, from my experience, it's typically more appropriate for large-scale projects like a wastewater treatment plan or something more significant where it makes more sense rather than a recreation facility where the services are highly subsidized to begin with in order to make them affordable and accessible to all.
And when you refer to your experience, are you referring to experience that you had at this time in June of 2012, or is that experience that you've gained since that time?
Is the question about my experience with public-private partnerships?
What you described to us, that you had the view that they were more appropriate for large projects, less appropriate for a multi-use recreation facility, for example, is that a view that you held in June of 2012?
That is a view that I developed through attending sessions, reading information, and speaking to consultants from both the federal and provincial government as well as the private sector on these type of initiatives.
Okay. And had you had those experiences, and did you hold that view as of June 2012? Did you already have that idea?
Yes.
You mentioned the grain terminals, and you talked about the possibility of public-private partnership elsewhere and those funds being used to offset costs. Can you help me understand what you meant by that?
So once again, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but to the best of my recollection, I remember thinking and having discussions that there might be more suitable municipal infrastructure that we are required to or considering investing in that might be better suited for a public-private partnership. So, for example, the grain terminals required significant investment, and the town and council was not sure what to do with them. So we felt that perhaps putting out an expression of interest or some market sounding on the grain terminals, or Eddie Bush, which is a downtown facility that required quite a bit of investment as well, might solicit interest from more appropriate investors for a public-private partnership than just the recreation facility.
Okay, and I thought that I had heard you say in your answer, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong, that it's possible that the results of that public-private partnership could somehow benefit the multi-use facility. Was there an idea that the construction of the multi-use facility could be connected somehow to a public-private partnership related to another town asset?
That's absolutely correct. In fact, in reviewing funding strategies other than grants, we felt this would have been perhaps one of the most viable opportunities to get significant investment into the municipality to potentially offset the cost of the recreation facilities or any other infrastructure or debt that the town may have.
Turning from that explanation, and thank you for it, back to this slide here where you've set out the questions that Council was to answer at this session. Do you recall whether you got the answers that you were looking for to these questions at the strategic planning workshop?
To the best of my recollection, I don't believe I was clear after this session.
We could turn to paragraph 143 of the foundation document. This paragraph summarizes the minutes from that strategic planning workshop. And you can see that Mr. Houghton spoke to the goals of the session. You provided an overview of the project completed to the date and the matters that are outstanding. It looks like Treasurer Marjorie Leonard reviewed the internal funding options, and then each member of council provided comments on their vision for the redevelopment. And then if you could scroll down, you'll see a list of the comments that were recorded in the minutes. Maybe we could scroll down a little bit further to see the end of the paragraph. Okay, and then you can see at the bottom here, the minutes reported that Mr. Houghton provided a brief summary and discussion on next steps. Staff will prepare options based on the discussion for consideration at a future council meeting. Do you recall what you understood staff was to do after the strategic planning workshop?
It is my recollection that the purpose of this strategic planning session was to gather some of the ideas that were all being tossed around after the Central Park Steering Committee recommendations were brought forward. And both myself and members of the senior executive team were struggling to identify where we should go, and thus we held this workshop. And it was at this workshop where the menu grew versus having greater clarity on direction. So I believe and recall that we took away the information and were to bring back a report to council for them to give us clear direction.
Okay. And we can see from the documents that you put together a document that set out two different directions that council could choose from, and then there were options within those two different directions. I'm going to ask you some questions about that in a second, but before we get there, I just want to ask you about a meeting that you were invited to with Sprung. So if we could turn to paragraph 103 of the foundation document. And we're moving around a little bit in the timeline. I just want to identify that for you. We were talking about a meeting that took place on June 11th. I'm now taking you back in time to April 18th. This paragraph describes on April 18th, Mr. Houghton sent you a calendar invitation for an April 27th meeting with Pat Mills, Sprung Building. You indicate that you had a scheduling conflict and ask if you should reschedule, and Mr. Houghton responds, no. This is a salesman, but I didn't want to say no to him considering Amoresco. And if we scroll down, the documents indicate that it looks like the meeting happened. You see at paragraph 105 on April 26th, Mr. Mills emails Mr. Houghton to thank him for taking the time to chat about Sprung Buildings. He also thanks Mr. Houghton for offering to let Mr. Mills know when the town would be welcoming expressions of interest. And then he talks about potentially meeting the Central Park Committee. Did you attend the meeting that Mr. Houghton had with Mr. Mills?
I don't believe I did.
Do you know if Mr. Houghton came back to you and described to you what happened at his meeting with Mr. Mills, or did you hear anything further from Mr. Houghton about his discussions with Sprung at this time?
I can't recall any specific conversation about Mr. Mills, but I do recall having a conversation with Mr. Houghton and the executive management team about a Sprung option, but I can't place it in the appropriate time.
Okay. We're now going to move back ahead in time, back to June. So if we could turn to paragraph 155 of the foundation document. This paragraph described an email that Deputy Mayor Rick Lloyd sent to Mr. Houghton on June 12th, so the day after Council's strategic planning workshop we've been discussing. Here we see the Deputy Mayor ask Mr. Houghton, would you get a price for a fabric cover to go completely go over the Centennial Pool and building at Heritage Park, and please get a cost for a fabric building to go over the outdoor ice pad at Central Park. If we scroll down to paragraph 157, describes that the next day, so June 13th, 2012, Sprung representative Pat Mills emails Mr. Houghton. Mr. Mills notes that Ms. Hogg, Mr. Houghton's assistant, had suggested Mr. Mills follow up after the June 11th, 2012 council meeting. And Mr. Mills asks about meeting with the Central Park redevelopment team. Mr. Houghton responds, writing, I've been asked by a member of council to get a rough estimate for the installation of 2 fabric buildings. Can we discuss this? I'm going to stop there for a second. Do you remember if you were aware of Deputy Mayor Lloyd's June 12th request that staff get prices or this exchange that Mr. Houghton had with Mr. Mills?
I don't believe I was aware of this discussion, but I do recall, and it could have been at the fire hall opening or after that, that the deputy mayor did throw out the idea of this membrane cover and that we should be looking at those options as staff.
I'm going to turn your attention to paragraph.
Can you just hold on for a second? At the strategic planning session, was there any discussion of putting fabric buildings over facilities that you can remember?
I can't honestly answer yes or no without looking back at the list of options because there were so many things discussed and it's a little bit hazy for me at this time.
Could we turn back to paragraph 143 of the foundation document, please?
If we could scroll down a little. A little further. A little further. To answer your question, Your Honor, based on reading this document, I don't believe the sprung structure was mentioned that day. I know there had been previous discussion and occurred there to put some sort of cover over the outdoor ice surface, and there had been previous concepts of that looked at, but I don't believe it was the sprung structure that was named.
If we could turn to paragraph 159 of the foundation document. So this paragraph describes an email that Deputy Mayor Lloyd sent to Mr. Houghton, Council, yourself, and the EMC on June 14th, 2012. The subject is Centennial Pool / outdoor rink, and in his email, Deputy Mayor Lloyd writes, I would like to request, if at all possible, to have a price for a building that would enclose the complete Centennial Pool. A building structure that I would be interested in is the building produced by Sprung Building Products. He goes on to say that he knows that they have representatives in Ontario. He also says as well, I would recommend to get a price as well for one of their structures to cover the outdoor rink. Sprung building systems are used for ice rinks, single, double, and triple ice rinks, as well as swimming pools. And he gives some information about the kind of warranty he thinks they might have. Do you recall receiving this email?
Yes, I do.
If we turn to paragraph 166, while we're going there, what was your reaction to receiving that email a couple of days after the strategic planning workshop?
The email you just showed me. In going back to what I describe as a difficult time, this is an example where, based on my experience and my commitment as a public servant, my responsibility was to take direction from council as a whole. And here we had various individuals on council directing staff's work without that information coming before council as a whole. And that's when I would turn to the executive management team, because I no longer had a single layer to report to in a CAO as to why we're responding to individual requests when we should be receiving information from council as a whole. And in my opinion, staff should be recommending decisions to council based on industry best practices and research, based on priorities or direction council gives as a whole. Instead, we were scattering around looking at every option possible. And I feel that executive management team was trying to help me frame responses to all of these to come to council as a whole, but no one was stopping the individual requests from bouncing around behind the scenes.
Deputy Mayor Lloyd's June 14th email is to yourself, members of council, and the EMC. We can see that certain members of council reply to everybody on the chain voicing support for the idea. Does that change your view of the nature of the instructions that you were receiving and the difficulty that you saw with them?
No.
Paragraph 166, which is on the screen in front of you, describes a step that you took in response to the Deputy Mayor's June 14th email. It says here that you forwarded that email to Town Manager, Recreation Facilities and Arena Supervisor Dennis Seymour and Coordinator, Registration and Permits Darren Potts, and you wrote, saw this one coming. Can you please confirm some approx pricing and what specifically it would could include for both? Scroll down a little bit further, and this paragraph describes that you also emailed Mr. Houghton, writing, we've done some preliminary work in this area for the ice rink. There are some limitations. We'll expand for the pool, and I'll provide you with an update once we've compiled the info. I have a couple of questions for you about the emails you sent that are described in this paragraph. If we could scroll back up to the top. When you said that you saw this one coming, do you remember what you were referring to?
Yes, and this is where I felt I got caught in the kerfuffle behind the scenes, and I was referring to the message that I heard at the opening of the fire hall that told me, mark my words, in several months you'll see that pool covered. And once again, once the processes started doing a lot of behind the scenes emails, giving direction, that's when I started going to my colleagues saying, we can't do our business this way. It needs to be in front of all of council, and we need to have open, accountable direction, transparent, that we then take away and provide the appropriate research and response to. So I do recall this very clearly, and I don't feel good about this one.
When you said that you were going to colleagues to say, we need to be approaching this in an open, transparent way, who were you speaking to?
The Executive Management Committee, but primarily the clerk and the treasurer, and Ed, and Mr. Houghton.
And what reaction or response did you get from them when you brought that to them?
In short, I would often get a response that, Marta, this is Collingwood, and that's not how we do things here.
Turning back to the email on the screen, you asked Mr. Seymour and Mr. Potts, can you please confirm some approx pricing and what specifically it would/could include for both? What did you envision them doing to confirm approximate pricing in response to the Deputy Mayor's request?
Could you please scroll up to the original email, and then I might have better context.
That paragraph 159 of the foundation document.
Thank you, that helps.
So we'll go back down to 166, which is the paragraph that says at the email that I'm asking you about right now. So the question is, do you remember what you envisioned Mr. Seymour and Mr. Potts doing when you asked them to confirm some approximate pricing?
Yes, I recall that the membrane structures was something that I was not familiar with, especially in this type of scenario. and that I asked them to just do some research because it implied for both the outdoor pool and the outdoor rink to be covered, and to get some preliminary research on, has somebody else done it, what have been the results, and what were the approximate costs, so that we could enter the discussions with some relevant background if there was some available.
In terms of the research that you asked them to do you remember if you talked specifically about what that research would involve?
I don't recall specifically, but I vaguely recall that it wasn't in-depth analysis. It was just to find out some information on industry relevant projects in Ontario that we might be aware of.
Do you recall if there was any discussion about reaching out to any particular supplier of that kind of a building, or limiting research to the internet or anything like that?
I can't recall.
Do you recall how you saw the Deputy Mayor's request to look into pricing for these kinds of buildings? How did you see that request fitting into the work that staff was going to do further to the strategic planning workshop?
I felt that the email made or started making conclusions or providing direction prior to us coming back to council as a whole to make recommendation, or to make direction, to provide staff with direction on what we should be working on next.
If we could turn to paragraph 152 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes minutes from a department head meeting from the same week, took place on June 12th, the day after the strategic planning workshop. And the minutes state that Mr. Houghton confirmed that staff will draft fact sheets to clarify the requested motions, which would be considered by council at the June 25th meeting. Mr. Houghton suggested that in order to provide council with a comprehensive report, it may have to be delayed to the following meeting. And if we scroll down a little bit further, this paragraph describes an email that Mr. Houghton sends to council and the EMC about the strategic planning session after the department heads meeting. He reports that at the department heads meeting this morning, we discussed the commitments we made to council and the best way to deliver on those commitments. As well, we've taken note of the recent emails requesting further information and clarification regarding Central Park project and commitments made to the Y. He says all of these requests will be reviewed with Marta and the executive management team, and we will prepare a thorough response and provide fact/data sheets to support the requested resolutions. Do you remember working on fact/data sheets in response to the ideas that were brought forward at the strategic planning workshop?
No, I don't.
Do you recall anyone on staff doing work further to the ideas that were brought forward at the strategic planning workshop?
Yes, I do. And I recall myself and the executive management team doing a report to summarize and present options for council to give direction on. But again, this was contrary to any other process I've ever taken in this type of circumstance. And no, we did not, to the best of my recollection, provide data fact sheets on all the options, nor could we in the turnaround time that was proposed.
Did you express the view at the time that this was contrary to the generally accepted practices in your experience?
Amongst my colleagues?
Yes.
On numerous occasions.
And, all right.
And just to follow up on that question, what response did you get when you brought it up, when you brought these things up?
On numerous occasions, I was told that that's not how we do things in Collingwood. And I felt appreciated by my colleagues, but not my city process perspectives. It was clearly stated that we do things differently here.
Did those responses have any impact on the kinds of concerns or issues that you would raise with your colleagues as you went forward?
Absolutely. And that's why often I would call on them to sit and at least put all the background pieces that were fluttering around in one document so all of council could see them and vote on them and give direction to staff, especially when we were shifting direction from what was to explore a multi-purpose center and now to do multiple projects at multiple sites.
Your Honor, I'm looking at the time and I'm about to move to a new section that will take some time to move through.
We'll take a short break.
Thank you.
Order all rise.
Before the break, we've been talking, amongst other things, about a strategic planning workshop that Council held on June 11th, 2012. We see that you bring a document forward as a result of that workshop at the July 16th, 2012 Council meeting. I'm going to ask that it be shown to you on the screen. It's at CJI 8028, and it begins on page 135 of that document. Please feel free to direct the court operator to scroll through this. My first question for you is, do you remember drafting this document?
Yes, I do.
You can see from the very beginning of this document, which we're looking at right now, that you've got two directions here. Direction A, Central Park redevelopment options, and Direction B, other project options. Before we delve into the contents of the document, just a high-level question. This is a summary of resolutions. It's not in the form of a staff report. Do you remember why you created this document in this way?
I know I said this before, but the process which we were undertaking was unfamiliar to me, and there was information coming from multiple sources that I required clarity on. So I would seek the input of members of the Executive Management Committee to help me get clear direction from Council, and based on the discussions we had, we determined that this might be the clearest way of seeking direction, because there were open resolutions on from Council confirming one thing, yet there were other indications that we're doing different work, and we needed to give either closure or continue along the path that was already approved, or then clarify formally new direction. So that's why. But again, this is an unfamiliar process to me, but given the circumstances, it felt like the most appropriate way to address all the outstanding pieces.
You referenced having discussions with members of the Executive Management Committee about putting this document together. Do you remember which members of the Executive Management Committee you spoke with?
I definitely spoke with the clerk, the treasurer, and Mr. Houghton. I know Mr. Irwin was also on the committee. He may have been at a meeting where we discussed this as a group, but I know I had numerous offline conversations, and I know this consumed a lot of our time on top of other important work that needed to continue for everybody. And that's why I refer to it as difficult, because we were juggling a lot of balls and trying to set some clarity on, as you can see, a lot of different directions that were being proposed.
Other than the consultation that you had with the members of the Executive Management Committee, did anyone else from staff assist you in preparing this document?
I'm sure there were other staff on my team that would have helped me, primarily the administrative person, but I would have likely included the manager of facilities in discussions as well.
If we could turn to paragraph 234 of the foundation document. And actually, let's start with paragraph 233. With respect to direction B, we've reproduced the resolutions that were put forward under direction B, and they're right here. If you look at, and you scroll down so we can take a look at that entire box there. You can see that the resolutions include construct a single pad arena, enclose the outdoor rink with a fabric building, that's number 6. Number 7, cover the outdoor rink with a roof structure. Number 8, enclose the outdoor pool with a fabric building. We'd go on to paragraph 234 of the foundation document. This highlights that the document that you prepared with respect to the options under direction B said adding new or different components would require additional architectural/engineering work. It goes on to say council will need to provide staff with clear direction and resources on the priority options to be explored. And it goes on to add additional public/stakeholder engagement may be required, as well as the development and costing of conceptual drawings and a 5-year business plan. Have some questions about that. What additional architectural/engineering work did you foresee if options under direction B were selected by council?
In my experience, any capital project that we would undertake should have appropriate drawings, costing, and an operating business plan associated with it. So there were numerous options on the table for which none of those existed, and that's why I believe I stated and repeated that message.
And the information that you've identified there, the drawings, the costing, a business plan, is that all work that Town of Collingwood staff could do in-house, or would you expect that you would need to retain some external assistance to get that work done?
The majority of that work would require external expertise. There could be some work on the business plan that staff could have assisted with, but certainly not if they were doing it for multiple options. It would take them away from their day-to-day duties, and our resources were already stretched with what we were currently trying to do. Never mind, we didn't have a whole capital planning team to do this type of work.
I'll ask you more questions about this later, but where we're at right now, we know that a staff report goes to council on August 27th with some recommendations. To your mind, was the additional architectural/engineering work that you envisioned needing to be done, was that work done in advance of the preparation of that staff report?
There was some analysis of options, but in my opinion, no, there was no detailed conceptual design and costing done.
And this paragraph references additional public/stakeholder engagement that may be required. What was your view on whether public stakeholder engagement was, the required public stakeholder engagement was met in advance of that August 27th staff report?
I believe the reason I chose the word may is because if we were moving away from any concept that was different than the one we already consulted the stakeholders and public on, in my opinion, we should have done new stakeholder engagement. And no, I don't believe that was done prior to the August 27th report.
Take you back to the summary resolutions document itself, which is at CJI 8028 on page 135. And I'm going to turn to what this document says about the direction B options, and that starts at page 140. There's an introductory paragraph that that talks about, as a result of the recent council workshop, numerous other considerations have been raised, and then it says that the options include the following. And as you can see, you've got a chart here that sets out the option with some benefits and some challenges. I would like to look at a couple of specific entries within this chart, starting on page 143. Perhaps it's 142. So for starters, this list of options, you recall if staff reviewed the options that were generated at the strategic planning workshop and otherwise, and selected a subset that they were recommending that council consider? Or was this a list of all of the options that had been generated by council at and since that meeting?
To be honest, this is the first time I'm seeing this document since it was presented, and I didn't even recall the detail we got into on this. So I'm pleased we at least had this much detail given the turnaround time, and I recall now us working on this. How we chose which options we were going to focus on, I believe it was through the work of several senior management, so myself, likely the clerk, the treasurer, and Mr. Houghton. But I can't recall how we specifically made the decision which one stayed, which one didn't. I think it was by what we determined to be the greatest interest based on what we had heard to date.
And what you had heard from whom?
From various members of council.
So the selection criteria you used was the greatest council interest as opposed to information you had from public and stakeholder contacts and things like that?
Yes.
If you look at item 8, so we'll have to scroll down a little bit. This part of the chart considers covering the outdoor pool with a fabric building. For benefits, it lists create additional year-round access to a 25-meter swimming pool, expanded programming opportunities. Under challenges, we've got requires further investigation to determine feasibility. Do you remember what you were referring to there?
I believe I was referring to understanding this construction type, understanding the costs, and understanding any concerns with covering this type of application in our scenario. The bullet below it speaks to related concerns, the fact that it was an older pool, and did it make sense, or was there a benefit? So there was a whole series of analysis that I believed needed to occur before we made that type of commitment.
To your knowledge, did any of that analysis that you have described to us take place before council voted on how to proceed with the rec facilities on August 27th?
In my opinion, no, it didn't, and I expressed concern about that.
When did you express concern about that?
I expressed concern. I expressed the need to do that as the report was being framed, and I expressed concern when the report was completed that we omitted that piece of work.
What was the response you received to the concerns that you expressed?
Why am I being resistant? Why am I not a team player?
And who are you having that conversation or those conversations with?
The CAO.
What can you tell us about the context in which that conversation took place? How did it start?
After we were given direction to explore the two options and come back with more information, I was clear that there was work that was required that we would need external resources to do because of the timeline and the expertise. And I did have commitments that coming up in the next few weeks, and I was not comfortable in meeting a tight turnaround time. At some point, the CAO assured that the executive team could assist me with this and that they will meet that turnaround timeline. So I was assigned to work with Dave McNulty and given resources to have external expertise assist us in the analysis. Mr. McNulty and I drafted terms of reference together to provide to a consultant who we had hired during the Central Park work and was familiar with a lot of our infrastructure information to date. And we went through a proper procurement process, and we felt that adding this to their contract was within our procurement allowance. So we had them do the work to expedite it. We checked with them if they could do the work and tried to prepare a clear outline on expectations. Through that process, not directly through me, Dave McNulty was told numerous times by the CAO, questioned and told about what was to be in that report and what was not to be in that report. And it became kind of a dance, very similar to the difficult circumstance that I've been referring to, that I was not familiar with. And I kept trying to emphasize the importance of the scope of information we require so that all of council can make an appropriate decision. I had a commitment for my vacation with my family, but I said I would make myself available, and I communicated by phone, and somehow the report was shared with me, and I can't even remember how, to be exact, but I know that I had concerns that the report did not reflect the full scope of information that I felt was important. And Mr. Houghton and I had a very uncomfortable conversation where he was very angry and annoyed and yelling at me why I wouldn't just sign off on the report. And I indicated I won't sign off that I agree with the report, but I will sign off that I read the report, because I don't agree with all of the information that was there.
We'll come to some more detailed questions about the process that you described working with Mr. McNulty and the consultant. Just so that it's clear who you're referring to, who is the consultant that you're referring to?
I believe their name is WGD Architects.
From what we can see in the documents, you're on vacation from August 22nd to August 24th during that week. Drafts of the report are circulated during that week, and the report is finalized on August 24th. Council meeting is on August 27th. Do you recall where in the course of that week you had this conversation with Mr. Houghton?
I recall it was very close to the report deadline, but I can't recall the day.
Okay. Do you remember if the report had already been finalized and distributed to council, or if it was still in draft form?
I believe it was prior to it being circulated, because he was asking if I would put my name to the report.
Okay, we'll likely come back to that conversation with a couple of further questions, but for now I'd like to turn our attention back to the July 16th meeting. We had been talking about some of the challenges that are identified in the table for covering the outdoor pool. One of the things that isn't discussed here at least explicitly, is the concept of covering the outdoor pool with a fabric building as opposed to other construction types to be used for the pool building. Do you know if staff ever investigated other construction types for the building to go around the pool or to enclose the pool?
No, we didn't.
Do you know why that work was not done?
Because we were not given direction to do that. However, I assumed we would have investigated the benefits and the potential challenges associated with this type of structure, and we didn't do that either.
At this point in time, when this document is distributed to council, to your knowledge, did staff have any information that enclosing the outdoor pool with a fabric building was a good choice or the best choice for the town? Like, did it have any information that compared fabric buildings to other construction types already in hand?
Could you please repeat the question?
Yes. Did staff have any information in its possession by July 16th about covering the outdoor pool with a fabric building and whether that was a good idea?
As far as I recall, there seemed to be several conversations that occurred with Sprung representatives who represented a company that did fabric covered structures. And the only information we had was the information, the marketing materials from that company.
I'm going to have some questions for you about conversations that took place with Sprung in advance of this meeting, but I just want to close off our discussion about what happened at this meeting first. If we go to paragraph 250 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes the council vote that took place at the July 16th meeting, and if we scroll down, see that council directed staff to pursue two recommended options. Option number 1, construct a single pad arena that could be phased into a double pad. And option number 8, enclose the outdoor pool with a fabric building. The council direction is for staff to pursue those two recommended options and develop a project timeline and detailed estimates and bring the report back to council not later than August 27th, 2012. Do you remember receiving this direction from council?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember what you envisioned the staff report to contain in terms of information that you were going to bring back to council?
It was my recollection that I thought we were going to explore the options associated with a single pad arena and the estimated costs at both construction and operational, and the potential impacts on the rest of the park for in terms of infrastructure implications. And I also thought we were going to explore the benefits and concerns with covering the pool with a membrane structure. So I thought there were two components to the work.
Did you envision staff making a recommendation to council about a final decision for how to proceed with constructing either of these two buildings at the report that was going to be brought back on August 27th?
Not at all.
Where in the process towards a final decision did you think the August 27th report was going to put staff and council?
I felt that based on the information provided in those reports, that staff would be directed on one or both options to move into the detailed design phase, which would include further costing and fine-tuning of components and features, to include engaging citizens and stakeholders on the direction we were heading in. Can I just add something? And that final dollar amount would come back as a capital infrastructure project for all of council to approve after that was all costed.
Starting from the July 16th meeting, you had mentioned that you understood that there had been conversations with Sprung. I want to ask you some questions about what we can see in terms of conversations between the town and Sprung in advance of the July 16th meeting. If we could turn to paragraph 175 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes an email that Tom Lloyd from Sprung Structures sends to Town Manager of Recreation Facilities and Arena Supervisor Dennis Seymour, with a copy to Dave McNeil of Sprung and Patrick Mills of Sprung. In his email, Mr. Lloyd thanks Mr. Seymour for meeting yesterday, and he writes, "We look forward to assisting you with your plans, so please do not hesitate to ask if you need any further information. Pat, Dave, and I look forward to our further discussions." Were you aware that Mr. Seymour was meeting with representatives from Sprung on June 19th, 2012 or thereabouts?
I had no recollection of this until I saw the email, and I am not clear if I was aware of it or not.
If we move ahead to the next paragraph, paragraph 176, this describes an email that Dave McNeil of Sprung sent to Mr. Seymour on June 20th, in which he also references the meeting and says, "I look forward to coming up with a design that will not only meet but exceed the needs of both your town council and your user groups." He says, "I've created an FTP site with some Sprung drawings and renderings for you to take a look at, and I will begin putting some budget numbers together shortly." Do you recall if you were aware that Sprung was providing the town with drawings, renderings, and budget numbers towards the end of June going forward?
Once again, no, I was not.
Were you surprised when you discovered that this had been taking place at the time?
I just had no recollection of it, so I was surprised to see this information in the report, but there were other things that also surprised me in the report.
And just so I can clarify your answer, are you able to advise whether you didn't remember that this was taking place, but once you read these paragraphs in the foundation document, you had some recollection that these kinds of conversations were happening? Or is it that you don't think that you knew that they were happening at the time?
I had no recollection of them happening, but I had a lot on my plate at that time, so I don't want to say 100% that I was not aware.
One final question about this. If you look at the next paragraph, paragraph 177, here we see Manager of Fleet Facilities and Purchasing Dave McNulty sending Dave McNeil of Sprung an email on June 25th. And Mr. McNulty writes, "Further to our conversation last week, we have been piecing together some background information for the two sites," and he goes on to provide Mr. McNeil of Sprung a series of aerial photos of Heritage Park, information about intent for the arena, drawings for the outdoor rink, and photos of Central Park. Do you recall if you knew that this kind of information was being provided to Sprung at this time?
No, I do not.
We could move ahead to paragraph 183 of the foundation document. this paragraph describes steps that are taken to set up and confirm a meeting between Patrick Mills, Tom Lloyd, and David McNeil of Sprung Buildings with Deputy Mayor Rick Lloyd, Dave McNulty, and Sandra Cooper. Were you aware that that meeting took place?
I was not aware of that specific meeting and those specific parties attending. However, I had heard in conversations that people were meeting with people from Sprung, and that's when I would ask questions.
Were you ever given a reason why you were not included in these meetings?
To be quite honest, I did not want to be included in the meetings because it would have gone against a process that I felt was in accordance with good municipal business practice.
And what was that?
Meeting with the contractor about drawings and quotes without a formal bid process, or having direction to have that work awarded that way.
The conversations that you referenced in which you learned that people were speaking to people, I think is how you put it. What can you tell us about those conversations, starting with who did you have those conversations with?
I wish I could be crisper and clearer on it, but there were a lot of conversations at the senior management team about the direction we need to be heading, and it's different, and a lot of them reference direction from the deputy mayor. And I can't chronologically or succinctly put them in places or time or names, but for me to say that I was not aware would be inaccurate also, because I heard things and I tried to understand or reframe them, but it was not easy to do.
Okay. When you said that these were conversations with the senior management team, are you referring to the executive management team, the EMC as we refer to it, or are you talking about other people as well?
There were specific conversations with the EMC, but I know this was a topic of discussion at the leadership, or I can't remember what we were called here. Every municipality has a slightly different, where we were all in the room as well.
Department heads?
Department heads.
And those conversations with department heads, do you remember if they were in the context of the formal department head meetings, which we understood took place weekly, or more in informal conversations with members of that group?
I believe it was informal meetings, but I know Dave McNulty and I, because we were trying to find our way through providing information. He was not at department head meetings, but he and I would have conversation about what I've heard and what he's heard and try to frame it somehow. So those happened informally.
Was there ever any discussion of formally going back to council to seek clarification of the directions that have been provided to staff, to seek clear information about who was taking which steps, or to ask for additional time to meet council's requests for the staff report?
There were definitely a lot of conversations about going back and seeking clarity, which is, even though it may have not been as clear to you today, that is exactly what we were trying to do. But there was resistance from the Executive Management Committee to say to members of council that their behavior is inappropriate and we need to do our business differently, because our former CAO tried to do that, and there was fear in the organization that there would be repercussions, and that is not how we do things in Collingwood, is what I was told.
Can you be any more specific about who those conversations took place with?
The Executive Management Committee members, specifically with the treasurer, at times the clerk as well, and Mr. Houghton.
And the former CAO was Ms. Wingrove?
Correct.
We'd talked about conversations about going back to seek clarity about council direction. In some of the information you've given us so far this morning, you've referenced other things that were on your plate as Director of Parks, Recreation and Culture. You've also referenced prior commitments you had made to family vacation. Do you recall any discussion about going back to council to ask for an extension of time to come back to them with the information that they had asked staff to provide?
At that council meeting, I clearly stated that that timeline would be problematic for me. As far as I was aware, I reported to the CAO still, and the CAO indicated right away that not to worry, that the Executive Management Committee will assist me and will ensure they meet that timeline. It was not my position to question his decision to do that. That's how I felt.
Okay, then so I take it that was not a topic that you raised after the July 16th meeting, the notion of asking for additional time.
I may have raised it offline with them, but I wasn't going to raise it in council with them.
Do you have a specific recollection of raising the idea of asking for additional time offline with anyone?
Absolutely. I didn't understand what the rush was. This was very important information. This is where I kept restating these things, and I was viewed as being resistant.
Where did you get the impression that you were viewed as being resistant from?
The Executive Management Committee, specifically, mostly Mr. Houghton, but even the clerk and deputy, the clerk and the treasurer would say, get on board, this is how we do things here. And so
could we turn to paragraph 196 of the foundation document?
Just before you do that, were you ever given a reason for why there was a rush?
no.
This paragraph and the paragraphs that follow describe an exchange between some information provided by some people associated with the Collingwood Clippers, a swim team in town. Paragraph 196 describes Linda Simpson, parent of one of the swimmers on the Collingwood Clippers, sending an email to Mayor Cooper and Deputy Mayor Lloyd on July 3rd, 2012, in which she expresses support for the proposal to cover the Centennial Pool. She says that the Clippers had independently researched the possibility of covering the pool in 2010. She offered to provide the research and related files and proposed a meeting to discuss their research. So this is a contact that is being made with the mayor and the deputy mayor in advance of the July 16th meeting. Did you know that, or were you aware that the Clippers had looked at covering the outdoor pool? Is this information you were aware of before the July 16th meeting?
I was aware that the Clippers were interested in a cover for the pool. Upon starting, I had a delegation of stakeholders that wanted to meet with me about infrastructure improvements. The range was huge, which is why I came forward to council to talk about a multi-purpose community center along with other infrastructure upgrades, and to try to strategically prioritize them in the most cost-effective way for the greater good of this community. So when I met with the Clippers, and it was not Linda Simpson who I met with in one of those preliminary delegations, I indicated that we will be looking at aquatic and all our needs in due time, and you will be part of that process. So I did not look at the details of the type of structures they were proposing at that time.
Okay. When you said upon starting, were you referring to starting in the role of Director of Parks, Recreation, and Culture?
Correct.
So it was around the beginning of your time in that role that you had that discussion with about covering the pool.
Correct.
Were you aware that at the beginning of July, some people associated with the Clippers were speaking with members of council about covering the outdoor pool?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Were you involved in those discussions?
No, I was not.
How did you become aware of the fact that they were taking place?
Same way I was learning everything else. I would hear tidbits of information in meetings from a colleague.
Did you ever receive copies of any information that that the Clippers provided to the town about covering the outdoor pool? Did you ever see any of that information?
Yes, at some point I was brought into the loop and asked to work with the Clippers on what potential contributions they could make, because they implied that they could raise some funds or donate some money should there be a cover put on the pool. But at this point, I can't recall if that was after the sprung structure had been approved or before.
If we could turn to paragraph 219 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes that on July 16th at 4:04 p.m., so in advance of the July 16th council meeting in which council directs staff to pursue the building an outdoor arena covering the outdoor pool with the fabric building, Dave McNeil of Sprung emails Deputy Mayor Rick Lloyd, Mayor Sandra Cooper, Dave McNulty, and Mr. Houghton a link to budgets for 3 Sprung turnkey structures. And if you look at the subparagraphs below, there's a budget for a cover for existing Centennial Pool. There's a insulated Sprung structure to cover an existing outdoor arena, and then there's a budget for a new standalone performance arena. Do you recall, were you aware that the town had received these budgets from Sprung at this point in time?
No, I don't recall that.
Do you recall if you ever became aware that the town received these 3 budgets from Sprung?
I don't believe I did.
Going forward, staff has been tasked with pursuing constructing an outdoor arena that could be phased into a double pad arena, enclosing the existing outdoor pool with a fabric building. Who was in charge of overseeing the work that staff did to put together the requested staff report?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. At the end of the July 16th council meeting, council directs staff to pursue building a single pad arena that could be phased into a double pad and enclosing the existing outdoor pool with a fabric building. Staff is to come back with a staff report by August 27th. Who on staff was overseeing or managing the work that was being done to put that report together?
I felt that it was my responsibility to frame and ensure that report provided all the necessary information. However, I indicated that I could not complete that work without external resources, and I had concerns about the timeline, especially because I would be going away. And that is when Mr. Houghton said that he and the executive team would assist. So I still took the response, and that Dave McNulty would help with this report, and we also got resources approved. So Dave McNulty and I worked hard to set the foundation for WGD to provide us with the information that we would put in that report. But as I previously said, Dave McNulty was also getting direction from Mr. Houghton about what should or should not be in that report. So, although I would have seen it my responsibility, I indicated I couldn't complete that report fully in the time frame, and so therefore Mr. Houghton took it upon himself, and the senior I'm sorry, their name is
The Executive Management Committee?
Yeah, Executive Management Committee to complete that report.
Was there a specific point person designated to head up the report, assign tasks to the people that were working on it, respond to questions and provide direction? Was that ever?
I believed the work that WGD was going to assist us with was my responsibility, along with Dave McNulty, to frame. But clearly there were messages layered on top that they were to do this but not this, or why are they doing this? So there were other people intervening.
Who were the other people that you saw to be intervening?
Namely Mr. Houghton, but based on, and it was stated, and I don't know how, that other people told him that, for example, WGD is not to contact Sprung. That was stated clearly to us and to WGD.
Okay, and I'm going to come to some more specific questions about the work that WGD did for the town in a minute. Just a couple more general questions to understand what you've described to us so far. You said that other people were layering messages on top. You've identified Mr. Houghton as one of those people. Was there anybody else that you saw who was providing direction or management to the people who were working on putting the staff report together?
I certainly have a greater perspective now because I've read all the documents and have seen some of the background emails on this topic, but I did not know those things at that time. So as far as I was concerned, the clearest source of information that was coming down on this topic was through the deputy mayor. He was the champion behind this and was giving direction to the CAO.
Did you have any direct interactions with the deputy mayor about the work that was being done on the staff report?
No.
Do you remember how you formed the view that he was involved in the directions that were being given to staff?
His name was referenced by staff.
Are you able to tell us specifically who referenced him?
Pretty much everybody on the Executive Management Committee.
Anybody else?
Not that I can recall.
One final general question before we get into the specifics of the work that you were involved in doing for the report. Do you recall at any time whether there was a discussion about the criteria that would be used to evaluate the different kinds of construction options for the arena to help pick what was a better or a worse option for the town?
Yes, I remember numerous discussions on that topic, and when Dave McNulty and I would work on that together, and then he would go away, and often that would be changed by Mr. Houghton.
Okay. What can you tell us about the discussions about the criteria that would be used to evaluate the options for the arena?
It felt to me like nobody really wanted good information on all the options.
Why did it feel that way to you?
Because it felt like it was already being slanted to a decision to cover it with a sprung structure.
And what led to you forming that view?
Because from what I can recall, when we try to outline criteria and what you would normally analyze in a feasibility study, that was being shut down from other places, which I wasn't always part of and couldn't fully understand.
What other places were shutting down the work you were trying to do to set up the feasibility study?
From what I recall, it was the CAO in direct communication with Mr. McNulty.
Okay. I'm going to turn to some specific questions about the work that you did with WGD and Mr. McNulty to look at some options. If we could turn to TOC 548266. These are the minutes of a department head meeting that took place on July 17th, 2012, so the day after the July 16th council meeting, where staff were given direction about what options to pursue for the town's recreational facilities. If we could scroll down to page 2. To the bullet identified as Central Park, the minutes report that council requested they be provided with a staff report for their August 27th meeting. The staff report is to provide substantiated estimates for building a covered single ice pad at Central Park and cover Centennial Pool with a bubble-type fabric cover. Is that what you recall staff was instructed to do?
I'm reading the words for the detail, sorry.
Take your time, take your
Staff
time.
report is- In reading the minutes, I don't totally agree with bubble. However, a membrane cover would be appropriate for what the direction council gave for the pool. And I would say the rest is accurate.
Does the phrase substantiated estimates mean anything in particular to you?
Yes, that's the analysis part that I was trying to ensure was reflected in the terms of reference of the work.
Okay. And if you look at the next paragraph, it reports that you're grateful that there is a recommendation to allow the existing market sounding budget to be used for this purpose, and it goes on to explain that your reasoning for working with WGD. It also says Marjorie agreed to talk offline and invite Marcus and Brian to assist with those discussions as they need to determine whether council's desire is to abandon the original concept or whether the project is being modified and staged for future expansion. Couple of things. Do you know who Marcus and Brian are? Who's being referred to there?
Yes, they are members of the senior team. They were department heads, and they were present in the meeting. And I believe the reason why we were going to talk with them is because nowhere have we had discussions about servicing and site preparation and parking lots and all that. And I believe there was interest to do that work in-house, and therefore it was intentionally left from some of the costing.
Okay. Is Marcus Furman?
Correct.
And would he have been part of the conversation because he would be providing input about,
Water servicing.
is Brian McDonald?
Correct.
And what would his involvement in those conversations have been?
So he was the I can't remember his title, but his involvement would have been from appropriate access points, parking lots, potentially even lighting and all the exterior components, traffic flow, where are the best access point. None of that site development work had been done for any of these projects.
Do you recall if you did consult with Marcus Furman and Brian McDonald to start to look into those questions that you've identified?
I don't believe I specifically initiated those discussions, but through the executive management committee, they were involved to some degree.
Do you remember if the kind of site design and preparation questions that you've identified for us were answered before the August 27th staff report was finalized?
No, I don't believe they were.
We could look at paragraph 261 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes a draft memorandum that Dave McNulty sent to you on July 19th titled Ice Arena Feasibility Study. And in his email, he indicated draft terms of reference attached. If you can scroll down, there's an excerpt from his memo that describes background to work that had already been done by the Central Park Redevelopment Committee. And then if you move down further, we've reproduced a table that was set out in that memo. And at the top it says, could you scroll up a second? The following scenarios are to be considered as a minimum. Alternatives may be provided should they enhance the opportunity for part of the project to go forward. And Mr. McNulty has set out a draft table indicating scenarios that WGD was to consider. This memorandum was limited to the arena. Do you recall if WGD was asked to do a similar exercise for the pool?
When I was reviewing these documents, that was a question I asked myself. What happened to the pool? And I was trying to recall, and I can't say 100%, but I feel that was part of where the work got switched on us, and we weren't allowed to look at the pool because somebody else was going to do that.
Do you remember who else was going to look at the pool?
Not specifically.
If we turn to the email at TOC 188039, this is an email from Dave McNulty to Brian Gregerson at WGD Architects. It's dated July 20th, 2012. It attached a Word document titled Ice Arena Feasibility Study. Mr. McNulty says, Brian, as discussed, if we could turn to that attachment, it's at TOC 0188040. In this memo that's provided to WGD, there's an introduction, and if we could scroll down talks about work done by the Joint Steering Committee. It provides a background information. Keep going. And then there's terms of reference. If you look at the second paragraph, it states that the town would like to explore the feasibility of moving forward with specific components of the projects in the preferred location of Central Park, either as a standalone or interim project or as the initial phase of the overall redevelopment project. It talks about retrofitting the existing Eddie Bush Memorial Arena, and it goes on to say the addition of a year-round ice arena at Central Park provides the opportunity to transition the existing arena towards a winter facility. If you look at the next paragraph, it says the feasibility of several options should be examined in terms of a comparison to the overall Central Park redevelopment project scope. This will allow the costs and benefits of various opportunities to be compared directly, while also enabling the preparation of operating estimates and the exploration of anticipated social improvements. Is this the kind of work that you thought WGD was going to be doing for the town?
Yes, it is.
And if we could scroll down to the top of page 3, again, we're looking at the following scenarios should be considered at a minimum, and then you see there's the proposed Central Park redevelopment project components, initial phase of a single pad arena, necessary park improvements, and the concept of a standalone single pad arena with the potential to twin in the future, minimal park improvements, and then finally the upgrade of the Eddie Bush Memorial Arena. Do you remember asking WGD to investigate these concepts?
I do recall working with Dave, and we landed on this in some shape or form.
Other than you and Mr. McNulty, was there anybody else at the town who was working with WGD on this project?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's our understanding that you went on vacation from the period from July 23rd to in or about August 3rd of 2012, so shortly after this email is sent across. What involvement did you have in the work that was being done to prepare the staff report while you were on vacation?
I can't recall completely, but I know it is my practice to be available when needed. And I know on numerous occasions while I was on vacation, if there were critical decision points or issues that came up, I would make myself available. And I believe I did through this process.
Okay. Do you have any specific recollection of speaking with anyone about the work that was being done for the staff report while you were on vacation between July 23rd and August 3rd?
I can't recall specific items or conversations while I was on vacation, but I know there were several things I had to follow up on this project, even concerns about meeting timelines and obligations according to the work we needed. So I recall that, and I recall seeing that reinforced through emails I saw in the documents.
Okay. You recall there were things that needed to be done. You recall that your practice was to make yourself available. You don't specifically recall any particular thing that happened?
No.
Okay. We could turn to paragraph 270 of the foundation document. And actually, if we could just scroll back up to 269 for some context. Paragraph 269 describes that Briard and Gregerson of WGD sent Mr. McNulty architectural drawings on July 24th, 2012. Mr. Gregerson described those drawings as the current concept for a single pad arena, and the drawings included a drawing labeled pre-end structure and a drawing labeled sprung structure. And in a follow-up email, Mr. Gregerson confirmed that the drawings included a sprung structure. It doesn't appear that you were copied on that email. Do you remember being aware that these drawings had been provided?
I can't recall either way.
If we could turn down to paragraph 270. On the same day, so we're still talking about July 24th, Marjorie Leonard sent an email to the EMC and Dave McNulty. You're not copied on that email. I'm going to ask that you be shown the full email. It's at TOC 189770. So in this email, Ms. Leonard says, follow-up FYI, I just talked to Dave and asked him to continue with WGD on the following items. So she asks for redrawing some schematics to save different ball diamonds, pricing a bricks and mortar building that would be part of a phase 1 of a 2-pad configuration, plus estimating the operating costs, pricing a prefabricated steel structure that would be phase 1 of a 2-pad configuration, plus estimating operating costs. She goes on to say, leave the Sprung building pricing for now until the management team and Dave McNulty can meet with the Sprung people. Once we have the pricing and operating costs for the buildings from WGD, somebody, she identifies Ed, Dave and the management team, will contact Sprung to get pricing to ensure that we are comparing apples to apples. Were you aware that these directions were being provided in terms of how to work with WGD and the work that they would be doing?
No, I was not.
I think that you are on vacation at this time. Did you become aware that these instructions had been given after you returned?
Nobody ever shared the full contents of this email, but when I asked questions about how did we determine where the building was going to be situated, or where did all this come from, I learned that those decisions were made by members of the EMC, and specifically Marjorie was named.
Do you remember who identified Marjorie as the person who was involved in that process to you?
Sorry, Your Honor, I didn't hear that question. I wonder if Counsel could
Who told you that Marjorie Leonard was involved in making decisions about where on the site the arena would be placed?
When I asked questions of the EMC, they didn't withhold information that they knew, and they would have all answered freely, to include Marjorie.
Do you remember specifically who told you that Marjorie was involved in the placement of the arena on the site?
I recall Marjorie telling me. I recall the clerk telling me, Sarah, Miss Almas.
Do you recall becoming aware that Sprung was going to be involved in discussions leading to the staff report, including to ensure that staff is comparing apples to apples when it came to the WGD estimates?
No, this is, I haven't seen, I scrolled through most of the documents, but I didn't get through everyone, and that's the first time I'm seeing that written the way it is.
The concept more generally, though, that Sprung would be involved in helping staff ensure that they were comparing apples to apples when it came to the arena, is that something that you knew was happening at the time?
No, I just understood that nobody was to contact Sprung, or their information wasn't to be included. Somewhere that message got through to us.
Okay. Do you remember who that message came from?
A lot of my information I would hear through Dave McNulty, because he and I were working closely, and then I would go back and ask the questions of my colleagues on the Executive Management Committee. And my first point of contacts were usually the clerk or the treasurer, because they were in closer proximity to me. And they would answer me saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. We've been told.
Okay. I understand you to be describing how communication went generally as you're working with Mr. McNulty on this project, specifically with reference to the notion that staff is not to contact Sprung. Do you remember how you came to know that that was the case?
The only clear person that I recall telling me that was Dave McNulty.
Who did he say told him that that was the way it was supposed to be?
I believe it was the CAO.
What did have in terms of what you said earlier about not wanting to meet with a prospective bidder prior to the bid? Did it? When did you get the sense that there wasn't going to be a bid?
At this point, I still had no sense that there wasn't going to be a bid. And maybe,
Well,
can I?
excuse me, when you say at this point, what's this point?
When we were drafting the report.
All right. Sorry, you were going to say?
Sprung was not the only company that came into contact with us during this time, and it was awkward, and we tried to push. I felt we shouldn't be meeting with anybody along the way, but there were other companies that wanted to meet and talk about options, and I kept trying to frame, as I had in the email to Mr. Saunderson, who was the chair of one of the vice chairs of our committee, that we're not at that point yet. But sometimes I would get invited to meetings with what I deemed to be vendors that we shouldn't have been meeting with at that point in time.
What vendors do you recall being invited to meet with?
Amoresco. They were, Amoresco and Greenland were together. And I recall the Sprung ones asking as well.
Anybody else?
Not that I can recall at this time. I recall others asking and us saying we're not at that point.
What do you remember about the other vendors that sought to meet with the town and were told we're not at that point?
They took that information and were waiting patiently for the time that we were going to put out the RFQ.
Can you specifically identify which companies or entities those were?
I can't recall their names offhand. I know there was one I recall even reviewing an email in the documents.
Generally, do you remember the nature of the kinds of things that they wanted to talk to the town about? What kind of buildings? What kind of project design?
They were potential solutions to the infrastructure we were looking to replace or build.
Do you know how the decision was made to meet with certain companies like Amoresco, Greenland, or Sprung, but not with others that were seeking meetings?
If the meeting request came through me, I said we're not at that point. Unfortunately, other people invited me to certain meetings.
Who assigned Mr. McNulty to this project?
I believe Mr. Houghton did.
Is that typical? That the CAO would assign a specific person to a specific project?
Not many things were typical then, and Mr. McNulty, I believe at that point, reported to the Brian
McDonald?
Brian McDonald.
That doesn't mean anything to
Yeah,
me.
so no. In my opinion, it should have been through Mr. McDonald that the CAO would have assigned work. Yeah.
What was Mr. McNulty's skill set that he was using to assist in the work that you were doing for the staff report? You know, what was his area of expertise that he was bringing to the work you were doing?
So I don't recall his training and background, but he was hired as our facilities manager for all corporate facilities and to assist with our capital program. So I know he had skills related to that. However, like in many municipalities, you would have skilled individuals take the lead, but they would not have the capacity to do all the work. So a lot of that detailed work would be contracted out, and he would manage those contracts.
And was it your understanding in this case that Mr. McNulty was there to work with you in managing the work that WGD was doing, assessing the options for the town?
Yes.
Turning back to the email that's on the screen in front of you, the email TOC 189770, looking at the second last bullet point, it says Dave, JP, Wendy, and potentially Dave Wood will work on Heritage Park and enclosing the outdoor pool. Do you know who those individuals are?
I am assuming Dave is Dave McNulty. I am vaguely familiar with JP. I believe he was a staff person in the Public Works Department, but I can't say for sure. I believe Wendy is our parks manager who reported to me, and David Wood is a contractor, landscape architect, I believe, that did a lot of our park development plans. But that's the first time I've seen that phrase the way it is.
At any point before the staff report was finalized, were you aware that this group of people had been tasked with working on Heritage Park and enclosing the outdoor pool?
No, I was not.
Do any of those individuals have, to your knowledge, the kind of experience or expertise that you envision would be required to do a feasibility assessment of enclosing the outdoor pool?
No, they do not.
The last bullet point in this email is we will not ask for any further work to be done in relation to any pool amenities at Central Park. So it appears that the notion of doing anything to the pool in Central Park is being stopped, at least for the time being. Were you aware that that instruction had been provided?
No, I was not.
Did you have any interactions with anyone from Sprung during the time leading up to the council meeting on August 27th?
No, I believe I did not.
Did you have any interactions with anyone from the construction company BLT during the work that was being done in the summer leading to the August 27th council meeting?
Again, I believe I did not.
In terms of the limitations that were placed on who could be in contact with Sprung, who did you understand from staff was allowed to contact Sprung?
The CAO.
Were you aware that WGD had been given instructions that they were not to contact Sprung?
Yes, I was told that by Dave McNulty.
Did that instruction cause you any concern?
Yes.
What concerns did it cause you?
I was concerned that we were trying to respond to the direction that we were given by council by giving them accurate and as comprehensive information on the options as possible given the time limit, and now limitations were being placed on that work and I couldn't understand them.
Did you ask any questions about why those limitations were being placed on the work that was being done?
Yes,
Who did you speak to about that?
I recall speaking to both the clerk and the treasurer, and probably Mr. Houghton, not as much. And I was once again told, Marta, that's not how things are done here.
We could turn to,
Just before you do that, how long had you been there by this time?
I started in the summer or in the fall of 2010. So please help me, which time we're in?
Well, I think 2012.
Yeah, so getting close to 2 years.
And up until you were told this, had you the impression that there were peculiar practices here that, as far as that were peculiar somehow to Collingwood?
When I started, there was a different council and a different CAO. And at that time, there were no flags for me about peculiar practices. It was after there was a change in council and there was a change and the CAO was dismissed, or in that time leading up to her dismissal, there was clarity that things were shifting and the way we were doing our business was going to change.
we could turn to summary document 2-4, specifically paragraph 24. So we had been looking at a July 24th email in which Ms. Leonard provided our confirmed instructions that had been given to Mr. McNulty with respect to the work WGD was doing. This is this paragraph describes a July 25th email from Brian Gregerson at WGD to Mr. McNulty and Richard Dabris of WGD, thanking Mr. McNulty for the phone call and direction. In his email, Mr. Gregerson provided a summary list of what had been discussed on that call. With respect to Sprung, Mr. Gregerson writes that the arena design concept will focus on the pre-eng structure and a generic roof membrane system. Sprung is not to be contacted at this time, and he confirms that the pool is not to be included. I think we've largely been over this, but were you aware that these limits had been placed on WGD's work?
Yes, I was aware, but it was through Dave McNulty, and I had never seen Marjorie's email outlining those specific things.
If we could look at paragraph 275 of the foundation document. This paragraph describes efforts to set up a meeting on July 27th with Sprung. The invitation is sent to Dave McNulty, Larry Irwin, Marjorie Leonard, and Tom Lloyd. Do you recall if anyone provided you with information about what took place at that meeting?
I don't recall anybody providing information about what took place at that meeting. However, I do recall at some meeting, Mr. Houghton came and had product samples of the Sprung materials and talked about how wonderful they are.
I'm looking at the area that I intend to start next and the time suggests that this might be an appropriate time for the lunch break.
Mark?
Would all rise?
It's a 10-story building in the top. Well, never did get to the top of it. We were talking about the cables, I think, coming down on it. That was Alan Swallow. We're going down, and there used to be a rope and a stirrup handle hanging in the cage. And Alan says, I wonder if this thing works. And he gave it a pull. She sure worked.
Come to a stop, but the pulley didn't stop.
It was a
the motor.
safety stop on for the cage. When they pulled that, two dogs went out and rubbed against that wood track, and they just dug in, and that was solid. So the stop was all right; it's solid. But we looked out, and there's the wires coming down.
Right down past the cage. We were stopped, but the cable was still coming
There's a
down the
counterweight
other
on the
side.
cable, you know, to make it no load. It gives it traction in actually they call it the tractor on the top up there, the pulley with the grooves in. And the cage
That's pretty
stopped.
scary.